In Texas, a life sentence is supposed to mean exactly that. No parole, no do-overs, no second chance. Yet Susan Wright, a woman convicted of killing her husband with nearly 200 stab wounds, walked out of prison after serving just 2 decades. Today she is free. The issue isn't how the system allowed it. The real question is whether it ever should have. This case isn't simple. It doesn't fit neatly into categories of good and evil, innocence and guilt. It lives in the uncomfortable space between justice and compassion, between accountability and empathy, between what the law demands and what feels morally acceptable. By the end of this story, you won't be given an answer. You'll be asked to decide one for yourself. Let's start with what we know. January 13, 2003. Houston, Texas. Police were called to a suburban home where they discovered the body of 34-year-old Jeffrey Wright. He had been stabbed 193 times. His remains were wrapped in a sheet and buried beneath the soil in the backyard. His wife, Susan Wright, was arrested and charged with murder. In 2004, a jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict was unanimous. The court, the prosecution, the jury, all agreed this was murder. And yet, in December 2020, Susan Wright was granted parole and released. Nothing about her conviction changed. No new evidence surfaced. No ruling overturned the verdict. She remains, legally and officially, a convicted murderer. So what shifted? To understand that, you have to look beyond the crime itself and into the courtroom where 2 entirely different versions of the truth collided. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. They argued that Susan Wright carefully planned her husband's death. According to their case, she restrained him on their bed using bindings and duct tape, disguising the setup as something intimate to disarm him. Once he was immobilized, they said, she attacked over and over again, nearly 200 times. This wasn't panic, they argued. This wasn't survival. This was fury. This was vengeance. And the jury accepted that version. The defense told a starkly different story. They described Jeffrey Wright as violent, controlling, and abusive. They claimed Susan had lived under constant fear for years. Witnesses testified that Jeffrey used drugs and behaved unpredictably. The defense presented evidence of bruises, emotional distress, and a woman who believed her life, and her children's lives, were in danger. Their argument wasn't that Susan planned a killing, but that she reached a breaking point. That on that night, she believed escape was impossible. That what happened wasn't calculated revenge, but desperation after years of terror. The jury rejected that explanation. But years later, when Susan Wright appeared before a parole board, that same argument resurfaced, and this time, it carried weight. This is where emotions flare and opinions harden. But this is also where we need to slow down. Susan Wright admitted to killing her husband. That fact is uncontested. The debate has never been about whether she did it. It has always been about why, and whether that why should change how the system responds. If someone takes a life through planning and intent, the law calls it murder. That much is clear. But what if someone believes they are trapped, terrified, and out of options? The law has a category for that too: self-defense. But self-defense has strict limits. There must be immediate danger, no reasonable escape, and only the force necessary to stop the threat. This is where the questions become uncomfortable. Does fear explain 193 wounds? Does fear explain binding someone first? Does fear explain hiding the body afterward? Or does it cross into something else entirely? This is not an attempt to persuade you in either direction. This isn't about defending Susan Wright or condemning her. It's about recognizing that this case forces us to sit with contradictions. A person can be abused and still commit murder. A person can be a victim and still be responsible for a crime. And the justice system must decide which truth carries more weight. There is also another perspective that often fades into the background: the victim. Jeffrey Wright cannot speak for himself. He cannot deny or confirm the abuse allegations. He cannot explain what happened inside that house. He cannot defend his actions or contest the narrative that emerged after his death. When accusations surface after someone is gone, there is no trial for those claims, only testimony and interpretation. That doesn't mean the abuse didn't occur. It doesn't mean Susan Wright was lying. It means we will never truly know. And in a system built on evidence and certainty, that uncertainty matters. Because if society accepts that someone can be killed based on accusations alone, without the accused ever having the chance to respond, it opens a door that cannot easily be closed. So why is Susan Wright free today? The answer lies in Texas parole law. Even those sentenced to life can be considered for release after serving a minimum number of years. For Wright, that threshold was roughly 20 years. When her case came before the parole board, they reviewed her conduct behind bars, the circumstances of the crime, and whether she posed a future risk to the public. They concluded that she did not. That decision did not declare her innocent. It did not justify the killing. It meant the board believed she had paid her debt under their standards and could re-enter society. But parole is not the same as justice. Parole assesses risk, not fairness. It asks whether someone is likely to offend again, not whether the original sentence felt morally right. And for many, especially those who believe Jeffrey Wright was murdered in cold blood, her release feels like a failure of the system. Like a message that a human life can be taken and repaid with only 20 years behind bars. That anger is understandable. So is the opposing view, the belief that a woman trapped in a violent relationship, who may have acted out of terror and desperation, should not die in prison. Both reactions are valid. And that is what makes this case so divisive. If you had been on that parole board, what would you have done? Would you have said, life means life, regardless of context? Or would you have weighed the circumstances and concluded that further punishment served no purpose? Would you have centered your decision on Jeffrey Wright, on his children growing up without a father, on the finality of death? Or on Susan Wright, on the possibility that her actions were born from years of fear rather than malice? There is no clean answer. This case isn't just about one woman or one victim. It's about how we define justice. Is justice primarily about punishment or about understanding? Is it about honoring the dead or acknowledging the complexity of the living? Susan Wright is free. According to Texas law, she has served her time. But does that feel right to you? Does it feel just that someone who admitted to killing her spouse with extreme violence is living freely after 2 decades? Or does it feel just that someone who may have lived in terror is no longer confined? The truth is uncomfortable. The law and our instincts don't always align. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you had been the judge, what sentence would you have given? If you were on the jury, which story would you have believed? And if you were in Susan Wright's place, what would you have done? There is no simple answer, only the one you choose to live with.